Hello, and welcome to the April Forecast Direct. With us today for Forecast Direct is Vince Iacopella. Vince is a member of the Anderson Forecast Board of Advisors that was newly constituted this year. So he's a founding member of the Board of Advisors. He is Executive Vice President for Growth and Strategy for Alba Wheels Up International, a firm that leads in logistics, information, and technology providing services to international trading firms. Vince is a licensed customs broker and is the current president of the Pacific Coast Council of Customs Brokers and Freight Forwarders, and is trade co-chair of the 14th COAC Committee on Commercial Operations of Customs and Border Protection. Welcome to UCLA and Forecast Direct, Vince.
Thank you, Jerry. It's an honor to be here. Glad to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you here, and we want to dig into some of the issues where you are arguably one of the world's experts, which is supply chain and supply chain interruption. So a lot of the discussion about supply chains thus far has been about throughput at the ports, capacity constraints with on-land transportation, rail and trucking, zero COVID policy, changing of the compositions of goods demanded. But an important part of supply chains is the movement of goods across the ocean, especially from Asia, such ports as Shanghai and Yokohama and Ho Chi Minh City to Los Angeles and Long Beach. And so we want to dig into that particular aspect of supply chains today. And maybe we can begin pre-COVID, if we can all remember back that far. Set the stage for us. What was happening before the pandemic? So we're talking about 2017, 18, 19. And there was a time when it was thought that there were too many freighters and smaller freighters were being taken out of service. Set the stage. What was happening in the ocean-going freight business, particularly Transpac business at that time?
So Jerry, thanks for the question and thanks for the focus on the pre-COVID. And I'm relieved that you don't want to go back as far as 1987, which was my first year at 21 years old, coming to LA, spending 33 years in Transpac. But you almost have to, we weren't spending 30 seconds on it. I just remember coming in the late 80s and the tremendous opportunity as production was shifting to Asia at that time. And the ports of LA, Long Beach were becoming the gateway ports for North American markets. And I want to call out two other years. One would be 2010, which was post-Great Recession, which was the restocking year, the year that folks restock depleted inventory, and then again 2017. And the reason I call those 2 years out is I like to say they were mini dress rehearsals for what happened in the last 2 years, which was 20 and 21, because you'll hear a lot about systemic issues in Trans-Pacific supply chain. Some of those being pre-pandemic systemic issues, like the lack of leveraging advanced data, not leveraging all the technology that is available on shipping manifests or load plans, or each ocean terminal and ocean carrier having their own proprietary system with different levels of functionality for data. You heard a lot in the last 2 years about ocean carrier policy on equipment, what containers can go on what chassis. And then also there's the ever present labor issues in the ports. And that could be contracts, that could be automation. And also, what role does the government play, like the Federal Maritime Commission, in looking at what one might call unfair business practices? And way prior to the pandemic, the largest 10 or 11 ocean carriers really grouped off into three groups, three consortiums, right? And I love your question because I'll end my opening comments with your question. The reason those groups were greenlighted by the Federal Maritime Commission is that the narrative over the last 20 years was that the ocean carriers were not making money or not making a margin that was sufficient to their survival. And I don't know how much the listeners might know about the Hanjin situation 3 years ago, the Korean carrier that filed bankruptcy. But yes, you're right. Prior to the pandemic, for the last 20 years, the carriers were reporting much lower profits or losses. And ironically, the last 2 years, they've kind of made up all those losses in about 2 years. So pre-pandemic, all those things existed. I think what happened during the post-COVID rush and that this crazy demand for consumer goods that ensued was that these systemic issues just got exacerbated. They just got totally more acute. And I don't know if that, I hope that addresses some of the pre-pandemic issues that you might have asked about.
So you brought up something that we economists think about all the time as firms compete, and that's marginal cost. And there was a kind of technological, I don't know if you would call it revolution, but a change in ocean-going shipping as these large carriers like Maersk moved to very large freighters, triple E class, freighters that had 50-foot draft and beams of 160 feet, in the huge ships, which dramatically dropped their marginal costs, meant that they were the most competitive. So that sort of leads to two questions. Is this really the driving force behind the consolidation and the sort of elimination or bankruptcy of some of these smaller firms, first of all? And second, related to supply chains, is that way we're seeing events like Ever Given getting stuck in the Panama Canal and other very large freighters. I said Panama Canal, Suez Canal.
Suez Canal, yeah.
But the sister ship.
I heard it's coming to the Panama Canal soon. So.
Yeah, and the sister ship being stuck in the going aground in the Chesapeake Bay, and that may be leading to very large freighters avoiding the Panama Canal and increasing the attempt at throughput in Los Angeles and Long Beach. How does this change to triple E and very large freighters really affect ocean-going freight and the supply chain issues that we're seeing today?
Well, the trend on the large mega ships was pre-pandemic, Jerry, as you say, as carriers went to a hub and spoke system, kind of like the airlines, right? So I'm going to feed cargo into Singapore on smaller vessels, and then I'm going to put them on a huge vessel from Singapore to LA. A funny anecdote: as a customs broker and as someone whose customers are importers who are selling the goods, some of the byproducts of these mega ships were prior to the pandemic, were how long they took to unload. They come into LA. At the beginning, they would come into Los Angeles and take 5 days to unload, which was unprecedented, right? So there were all these byproducts of the big ships. You raise a great point about the canals, both of them, the Suez and Panama. It's amazing that we're talking about them so strategically still, hundreds of years after, about 100 years after they've been built, and had similar, well, the Panama Canal anyway, at least that long. I think that you raised two things. You raised infrastructure upkeep, right? An investment in infrastructure. You also raised a dredging question, the big dredging debate in the United States. Certain certain numbers of our ports, like Seattle, I think Los Angeles, Long Beach, are naturally deep. Many are not, right? Like Oakland, and so we need dredging for these bigger vessels, right? To keep them able to call these ports, and then you also raise the creation of these large ships, which I do believe had a margin motive. I think we all have to go back to 2010 and remember the Great Recession was, at least in discussions with our customers, was the zero inventory model became very popular, that I'm not going to hold inventory unless I've sold it or very close to selling it. And that we lived in that environment from 2009. So precisely at the time, these carriers are putting on these mega vessels. People were not moving these as quickly to Europe and North America from Asia. We've seen in the last year or so a reversal of that. August 2021 was probably the most acute situation where lots of companies wish they had inventory in the United States or Canada or Mexico or anywhere but on a vessel waiting to berth Long Beach or on a vessel stuck outside Shanghai, right? So I think the demand for consumer goods, the appetite for US sellers to hold inventory were all functions of how big those vessels are and will be.
And so a little earlier, you mentioned that these carriers, particularly in the three consortia, made back all of their losses and then some.
I believe so.
At least they're not complaining about losses right now.
No.
And in the last couple of years, but those profits ought to induce other smaller firms to bring back ships that have been mothballed. Are we seeing any of that, or have those ships gone to being broken up?
So we have seen that, and we've also seen these small carriers like One High, right, or carriers that used to be just inter-Asia add Ensenada or Long Beach onto their rotation. So we saw some small carriers go back into the North American market, and we've also I believe that the recent data came out in the media that there is an effort to bring more equipment back online. Whether that's going to happen by 23 or Q4 22 is uncertain, but there are efforts to put more equipment into the system.
Sure, if it's like airplanes, it takes a long time to bring a ship back that's been mothballed, right?
Yes, and my only caveat to that, and I hate it's probably useless to go back to April of 20, which was a terrible time for us all. But to go back to April 20, the argument was, did the carriers replace capacity as quickly as demand? And not all of those ships were mothballed in the traditional sense. So is a ship really mothballed where it needs to come back in 6 months? Or was it nearly idle in Singapore where it could have gone back in? And those are some of the questions asked about how quickly capacity had been brought back. I think that's kind of a moot point now, because the more capacity the ocean carriers put on, they filled. So now the motivation is to actually to add capacity. I would wonder, Jerry, if the motivation is there to add a lot of capacity, because then it's going to, drop the price a little bit. But I think the motivation is there to add capacity, as you said.
So a couple of weeks ago, maybe it's only 1 week ago, the president, I guess a couple of weeks ago, and then 1 week ago, Senator Warren echoed this, that the consortia, the three consortia that you described, were holding up prices in an oligopolistic sense, that a non-competitive sense, and that was one of the reasons why we're seeing higher consumer prices. What are your thoughts on that?
If you give me a couple of seconds on this, I think I'm gonna go back to the live UCLA session we did. a couple of weeks ago. I think the answer is probably yes to anybody who's, I don't think you need to be an economist to know that if your operating cost or your supply chain cost rises significantly, that probably needs to reflect in your sell price to consumer or to retailer. Although in the summer of 21, that a lot of companies were not able to do that because they were locked into contracts with the retailers, and they ended up getting margin erosion. They ended up making a lot less margin. It's pretty much an untold story that those prices were not all those prices were passed to the consumer. I think there has to be some truth to the fact that rising any price in the supply chain that significantly is going to result in a higher price along the way, because otherwise, how would the seller do it? Especially 12%, 14%. I think the craziness about 21 was having ocean freight prices 5 times, right? Not 20% or 50%, but paying 5 times. And I've said this before. I don't know if I've said it on UCLA, but some other platforms. There is an argument that prior to the pandemic, the price might have been too low, right? Maybe it was too low and needed adjustment. But I think 5 times is probably too high. So do we ever go back to anything called normalcy is a question. But when we come out of the pandemic related practices and buying habits, and maybe consumer demand is not as robust as it is now, what is the price, right? Where will that price be? And I think it'll be somewhere in the middle, somewhere. I think people have to companies will have to get used to higher Transpac prices than they were used to pre-pandemic, but at the same time can't support what happened in August and then again in January of 22 and August of 21. So and I do want to talk to this Senator Warren mentioned, and others have been mentioning for a long time. And by the way, there were many, many people in Washington, the Beltway, and on the West Coast of the United States that said this would happen. Not exactly this, obviously, but that this would happen with pricing and lane selection with the 3 groups. And the argument was, well, the 3 groups need the 3 groups for survival. And things were happening before this pandemic. For instance, decisions about where vessels go and how often they go are no longer made at all in the United States. So out of these 10 carriers, maybe 11 carriers, one might still be flying an American flag, but none of them are headquartered in the United States. So that brings in geopolitical questions. It brings in national security questions about supply chain. We went through 5 or 6 years in the 2010s of hey, what happens? And it's not a hypothetical, it happened. What happens if an ocean carrier takes 20% of capacity and shifts it to Europe instead of North America? They don't need anybody's permission to do that, right? So I think what Senator Warren and maybe the Biden administration was expressing was something that many have noticed years before, that obviously the U.S. loses a lot of leverage if we don't have one U.S.-based carrier. And I think I may be wrong on this, but I think when President Kennedy formed the Federal Maritime Commission in the early 60s, it was about making sure that we had one U.S. flag carrier, right? That's so many decisions are made in Geneva, in Copenhagen, in Singapore, in Shanghai, but there aren't a lot of decisions being made in LA, New York, and DC. So even before the pandemic, people saw some threats to the U.S. not having a dog in the fight, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. So this is much more nuanced, though, in terms of pricing and we're looking at spot prices, but maybe not average prices. Let's turn to what these ships are carrying, which is containers. And there seems to be some issue about moving containers around. The ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach threatened, I don't know if they really ever fully implemented fines for containers, empty containers staying on the terminal property. And kind of thinking about this, not knowing really the depth, not knowing what you wonder, if ships are leaving, if they bring in 10,000 containers or 7,000 containers, why aren't they leaving with 7,000, even if some of them are empty? And so what is the container issue that causes containers to be left in one place rather than somehow beginning to circulate and get back to where they're needed?
So I'm going to try and unpack this because it probably has many facets. First, I think we all need to realize that when my company or my customer orders a container in China, we do not choose the chassis company. We do not choose the terminal it comes out of. All of that is something we buy when we buy the ocean freight. So when you get to Long Beach or Oakland or Los Angeles or Seattle or New York, and someone says, well, the chassis issue is really Joe's problem, right, across the harbor. And the wheels issue is really Jane's problem across the harbor. That customer bought all those services from the ocean carrier. And that's why when you hear ocean carrier policy brought up, is those are decisions at a policy level that can change. Getting to the fee, the other thing is what's called the box rules, which should be relaxed. And that means that this ocean carrier's container can only go on this type of this company's chassis, right? And that's it. And if that chassis is not available, that container just sits. So these are policy issues that could be addressed. I will talk about the fee. And I've talked directly with the leadership at the ports, as have others, about this, sent some emails in. There was a lot of concern about the fee. The fee basically was threatened but not implemented. And in talking to the leadership of both LA and Long Beach at the Trans-Pacific Maritime meeting in Long Beach at the beginning of March, I think we all have a little better perspective. I don't think it's genuine to say that the ports never intended to implement the fee. I think there might have been an intention there, but there also might have been, let's see what we can do with the threat of the fee, right? And then thirdly, as a middle market company who serves middle market customers, no surprise here that the fee would have been exponentially more detrimental to middle market companies. It's like a lot of things. For instance, if you were a big box shipper, if you were a big retailer, you might have owned your own chassis. You might have had a 24/7 operation. And all of those things are more conducive to getting containers off the pier more quickly, right? But if you were a middle market company that was still relying on the ocean carrier for some of these really silly rules, right, about box rules and chassis and containers and hours of operation and night gates and things like that, not being fully utilized, then that middle market company, which was my customer, right, they didn't have control to avoid the fee because they didn't have control to get that container. And that was our big pushback. That the second big pushback, which is the most obvious, is that the port imposes the fee on the ocean carrier, and the ocean carrier immediately sent notices out that they were going to impose the fee on the customers. So here we had this transfer of the fee from the carrier all the way down the chain to the customer, and the middle market customer had no control over that. So we had a big problem with the fee in the beginning. Here's the postscript. The postscript is that the data seems to show that, I don't want to misspeak here, but 20 to 30% of the containers that were maybe stuck on the pier prior to this may have moved by those companies that did have control over chassis and night gates and 24/7 operations. So if that's the case, one can make the argument that it was effective and that moving a third of the containers off is better than nothing. And then ultimately the fee wasn't imposed, so no fees were really passed onto the middle market users. But it does raise another issue, I believe. It raises the issue about how bigger players have maybe more choices, right, in the market, and that we want to get to a place with advanced data, better ocean carrier policy, where small and medium-sized companies have the same competitive or more of a competitive role in some of these practices that can help get goods off more quickly.
Is there a shortage of containers worldwide because of an increase in world trade, or is that really not the case?
So I'm gonna semi punt on this one, because I've been in a lot of meetings with people on the Hill or Sacramento that say, just make more containers. Why don't we just make more containers? But if you make more containers and we don't change the data and policy issues, we don't change the systemic issues, right? We might just have more containers stuck in one place. So really, I think that more containers would not hurt, but things like loosening the box rules, a gray chassis pool, a unified platform, which, by the way, the Port of LA has, the optimizer, a unified data platform that's not specific to a terminal, that all stakeholders can share. I would go there. Not just me, I mean, the whole industry is thinking about this, I think would go in that direction.
So all of that leads to my final question for the podcast, which is, you've described systemic problems, the operations management or systems management problems, infrastructure problems, and the structure of the industry. The kinds of supply chain interruptions that we've seen during this pandemic lead one to think that there are going to be changes and that the industry is in evolution. I'd like to get your thoughts on where this is going and how long it might take and what it might look like once these issues have been resolved. Well,
thank you for that question, because I think ending on a semi-positive note is always a good thing. Looking at this, I don't think there's been this in discussions that we've been in, and there's a couple of pilot programs popping up, at least in LA and Los Angeles. And full disclosure, I'm sitting in El Segundo, so I'm cheerleading for our region, of course. But I really think that the ports of LA and Long Beach have been out front on this, because they were aware of these systemic issues before. Obviously, the Biden administration has put a lot of pressure on both ports, because 40% of ocean cargo arriving in the United States comes through those ports. So, but even before the pressure from the administration, Jerry, to your point, many see this as an opportunity to finally look at these issues and come up with something durable, something that leverages technology, something that really shares data. Labor issues are a bit more complicated, and they're about to become even more complicated in July, right? So, yes, I think that out of this bad experience all around, but if you look at other industries like finance, and they're going through the same type of thing, right? Like what worked, what didn't work. I don't think anybody wants to go back to the old problems, right, with no solution. So to answer your question, I think there's this window of opportunity is open to come up with serious issues. And if you ask me what I think is going to change, I think this data has been out there forever, for many years, and that leveraging advanced data to plan better, I think is something you're going to see right away. A lot of our companies are doing it already. And you also may see the Federal Maritime Commission with a more enforcement authority that they don't have now. There is a bill passed by the House that's in the Senate, which is Garamendi-Johnson, which would give the Federal Maritime Commission more enforcement oversight over the ocean carriers. So maybe better data, more advanced data, better technology systems, and probably more enforcement oversight by the federal government.
And the current geopolitical system or current geopolitical problems with a war in Ukraine make what you raised earlier, national security issues,
right,
more important and really coming to the fore in finding solutions, right?
That's a great point that I missed. The geopolitics of this, and the Russia component has a China component too, right? So the Russia-Ukraine component might have a China component. That opens up the whole dependency on China thing. So I think you're 100% right. The geopolitical situation could be the biggest wild card.
Mm-hmm. It makes it a bit more urgent to solve these problems in the coming years.
Yes.
Vince, thank you so much for joining us this morning and for the April UCLA Anderson Forecast Direct podcast. We have learned a lot about ocean-going freight, where it is, but also importantly, where it's going to be going, and how we're going to perhaps avoid next time these kinds of supply chain constraints, at least in ocean-going freight. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jerry. Thanks a lot. I really, really enjoyed it.